Welcome to the Autoimmune Campfire.
Join us, coaches Helen and Nona, for honest, heartfelt conversations around living well with a chronic condition.
Come sit at our campfire. There's a chair waiting for you. I just don't know that it's ever going to get old to see that intro. It's like, oh my gosh, that's us. Hello, Helen. How are you?
I'm well, thanks, Nona. How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing so well. I've been looking forward to this conversation all weekend, thinking about it. But before we dive in, what's going on with you?
Oh, nothing much. I just had a really fun weekend, though. I did a watercolor class. I swam at the pool with some friends. I had a lovely evening with my daughter. I walked with friends. It just was such a bucket filler and maybe a little bit too much. I'm a little tired this morning, but it was all really yummy stuff. So, how about you?
I love that. I saw your watercolors actually on Instagram and on Facebook. They were awesome. So cool. I'm so glad you're doing that. Sounds so fun. So we moved Clara back up to Fort Collins for her second year of college. And this year she's in an on-campus apartment with three of her friends. And it was so much fun because it was just her and I that went up to set everything up. And it was just great, like to see her get excited about where she was putting things. And so it was that was lovely. We also went climbing and I topped my first overhang 5'9". Oh my gosh, it was so exciting.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I was so excited. I was like, yeah. And also what I realized is that this is actually the 1 year anniversary of my hand going numb, which was the first thing that happened that led me to the diagnosis of MS. So I was like, oh, well, that works out well considering today we're going to be talking about my story.
Yes. Oh my gosh, yes. Well, so the idea in our first couple of episodes is to share our stories, our perfect storms, as I've heard doctors say to me before. And so I'm super curious. So Nona, that sort of tees us up. Tell us about your diagnosis and what led to it.
So, in fact, a year ago, Clara was getting ready to go to college for her first year. My father had just had a heart attack, and my daughter and I were climbing, actually, funny enough. And I was doing this really hard corner climb, and it was just so hard, and I didn't make it. And the next morning, I woke up and my hand was numb. And I was like, oh, well, that's weird. I probably pinched something in my neck. And I sort of really started going down this whole rabbit hole, like chiropractic, PT, therapeutic yoga, like all the things, like I've pinched something, like my hand is numb. And the doctor, when they finally saw me, they were like, well, let's give it a few more weeks. And they're like, it's not really acting like carpal tunnel, but they were like, it's probably carpal tunnel because of where it was numb. And I was like, okay. So I kind of stayed on this track of like, what can I do for myself physically? And then I went to Oregon to see my dad and help my family with my dad's health stuff. And on the way back, my left face went numb. Like, I thought I had burned my mouth because it was my upper left palate, just like numb after I drank some tea. And I was out in the middle of nowhere in Idaho. And I was driving and I was like, this is super weird. Like, what is happening? And then just over the next few days, the numbness just spread. And I was like, this is not right. Something is going on. And so I was kind of in the middle of providers at the time because the young guy who was like, well, we'll wait a couple weeks and see what happens. That just made me really mad because and so I went looking for another provider and there's lots of things that happened around that. But I eventually ended up getting an MRI because they were like, you've had a stroke. And I'm like, it's been months. I'm pretty sure I haven't had a stroke. look at me. And they were like, no, no, we have to rule it out. And the MRI came back. And because you were one of the first people I reached out to, because you get these reports on your phone, right? You've got that app. And the report, like, I don't know, like 20 minutes after my MRI, it's like doom, doom, doom. Like that's what it says. And I don't have an appointment with my doctor. And so I was like, what do I do with this? So I reached out to you. I reached out to a number of people I know just to help kind of bring me down off the ceiling. And then I ended up with a provider, with a nurse that really we're gonna talk about this later, synchronicities. She was such a synchronicity because he was a new provider for me. And the nurse looked at that and she was like, you need to go to Denver. There's nobody here who I want you to see. She's like, you have an unfavorable MRI and I want you to get the help you need. And honestly, I was on a wait list to see a neurologist here, and I still haven't gotten a call. It's like a year. Yeah, I still have not gotten the call to make that appointment. Yeah,
Oh my gosh.
yeah. Neurologists are so busy here, you cannot get in, and so they sent me up to Denver, and yeah, the first appointment was just with the general neurology department, and she was really awesome, and she came with me, which usually I do not invite my husband to come with me to appointments, but I was like, "I'd really like you there for this," and she was not the MS neurologist, but she walked me through it, and she's like, it's really probable that you have MS. Like, here are all the markers, here's why. And I'm like, but wait, we don't have a spinal MRI. But wait, we haven't done all of these other things. And she's like, we don't actually need to, given your MRI. It actually, I think, went pretty quickly, given how long it can take for people to be diagnosed with autoimmune disorders or chronic conditions. So I'm super grateful for that. But I will also say, like, in reading about it, like, there was a lot of stressful things happening in my life at the time when all of it happened. And I think that's something that I didn't really realize, but that's pretty well known in the medical community. Like super high stress times are very much the perfect storm for our bodies to show up with these kinds of things.
Yes, I love what you say. It is sort of like this perfect storm. And then so, you've mentioned Clara's just about to go to university, your father's heart attack, you're traveling. What else is coming up for you that you identify as part of the storm cloud?
Oh boy. Well, because Clara was getting ready to leave, I'd really kind of well, we had left Zambia and I had finished a master's degree right as we were coming back here. We had a really hard move back into living in Colorado. And when we got here, I'm like, are we really are we doing this? Are we staying here? Because we've moved every like 2 to 4 years for our entire marriage. And that's really kind of part of my identity is like, I'm expat, I move, I do all these things, I live in different places. And like, do I want to live here for the rest of my life? I don't know. But with all of those things, with my master's degree, the move, Clara leaving, I had really also kind of taken down my business. Like I was doing a little bit, but that too was like really stressful for me. And what am I doing with my life? Like, so Clara leaves, and she is my primary purpose, right? Like, I do not want to pass on any of the family dysfunction or, horribleness that my husband and I experienced, right? Like, I want her to be elevated. And I really had a strong sense of purpose in having her and raising her differently than I was raised, that Eric was raised. And so there was like this vacuum. There was just this void of purpose and meaning, plus all the stress that had kind of just been around. So that's what I would say. Yeah, those 3 really big. Because you know what? Let's be honest, I'm a Capricorn. Work is really important to me.
I love that. And you are an incredibly learned and productive person. I mean, I just have loved from the minute I met you watching all the things you've created. It's been incredible. So I totally get that. Um, so when, you know, at that point, so you took us to that point where they said, we don't really need anything else. Um, and you said, yeah, but I'd really like, and then you had to wait for your spinal MRIs. And in that process, you were trying to decide, you were gathering information, right? Trying to chart a course. Walk us through, you know, what was the hardest part in all of this?
It was really great because I met with that first neurologist and then I got referred immediately to the specialty clinic that handles neuroimmunology. So MS falls into that. And that doctor walked in and basically just, we spent, I don't know, 45 minutes with him talking about different medications that I could go on. And he was like, "So definitely keep exercising and then pick a medication." And so this was really shocking to me. I'm like, and this is something that if you talk to people, this is something that happens. Like the doctors are just like, "Here's the smorgasbord. What medication would you like to take?" And I'm like, "Why would I have a preference? Like, aren't you the doctor? Should you be telling me?" So that was really challenging for me to, it was overwhelming. It was like a fire hose of information. And I left that appointment, and on the drive home, I was thinking to myself, I'm like, well, why would I take medication in the first place? Like, is there a reason? So the other thing is that they told me that I've probably had MS for decades, like decades.
Oh, yes, yeah. Talk about that a little bit because I the MS hug.
Oh, yeah, like, so when we were, he was talking about, they go through a history with you, like, so they can understand, like, do they think you've had it, plus my lesion load? They were like, "Well, we really think you've had this for 30 years." So why? Because I have a distinctive memory at 19 of having what can only be described as what they call an MS hug. I was driving down the road on my way to the town next to where I was living on a dark road. It was foggy. And all of a sudden, it felt like somebody was just pulling a belt around my midsection. I could barely breathe. And of course, I couldn't pull over because I'm like, if somebody's coming behind me, they're going to hit me. And so I was just like, I just have to stay on the road and just keep going. And so that, I don't know how long it lasted, maybe 5 minutes. And then it went away and I never told anybody. I never told anyone. And when I told him, he was like, "That was your first MS hug." Because I've had those episodes over the years. Again, never told anybody. Why would I bother? So, anyway, it was super fascinating to have him say that. And I'm like, I remember thinking to myself, like, well, why would I take medication if I've had this for 30 years? Obviously, I'm doing pretty well. So why bother? And so it was hard for me to wrap my mind around, especially because I have, and I'm going to be very honest, like I've had kind of an anti medication stance. Like, well, if I can do it naturally, I'm not going to take medication. And I had to go through a really long, not a long process, but definitely a process of talking to people who took medication, people who didn't take medication, and like kind of coming to peace with the idea that if I take medication, I'm not failing, right? Like,
A absolutely, yeah.
so that was probably the hardest part, was determining what path I wanted to take given the given all the information that I had and the people I'd talked to and what I'd heard. And ultimately, what occurred to me, I'm like, I have actually been doing all the things, which we'll probably talk about, still ended up with a numb hand and a numb face. And that really, that and talking to people who had lost loved ones to MS, who had decided not to take medication until too, but ta and I was like, and my doctor was like, "Just give me 2 years." And I was like, "Okay." So that was the hardest part for me, definitely.
And I just want to say, I mean, I thought that you were incredible the way you leaned into the learning, both, you know, talking to other people who have the diagnosis, but also would you share about that phone call you had where the doctor called you to check in?
Right. Well, I mean, this really speaks to synchronicities and like feeling supported. And I think I'd finally sent the message like, I am not going to be taking medication, but thanks. And he called me on my lunch hour, like on my cell phone. And he was like, look, if you don't want to take medication, that's totally fine. He's like, but I do not want you to be one of the people who comes in 10 years regretting that you didn't take it because now you're disabled. He's like, listen, give me 2 years. Let's see what happens. He's like, but he's like, you could be one of the lucky ones and come in 10 years and be fine. He's like, "But you've just had this event happen, so please just go on the medication." And that was really impactful for me that he called at that moment. Like, it wasn't like he was like, "Oh, well, whatever." He was like, "I wanna support you, and I want you to be healthy, and this is what I can do for you." And what we have information that this is really a good path. And when he said 2 years, I was like, "Okay." Like, he was he didn't say to me, "You're gonna have to be on this the rest of your life." Like, he was very much like, "Just give me 2 years and let's see what happens."
Gosh, what an amazing. So, you've talked about some of these synchronicities, but isn't it fascinating when these people come in and it's just like it's just the message you need? And there's that element of, I mean, I think in both of these providers, both the nurse practitioner and this doctor, there was incredible compassion and empathy, but you also were seen. Right? They saw the whole of your picture. It wasn't just take it because now otherwise you're a pain in my rear or you might be right, whatever. It's like they really cared about your case. So I really love that. And I think, later in the series we'll talk about selecting your resources and advocating for what you need. And I love that you had those experiences right up. Of course, maybe if you talked to somebody 30 years ago and gone, what is that? But what I hear out in the autoimmune world is some people it takes years and years and years. So you may not have even got a diagnosis then, right? Um, but at the point that they had enough data to make a diagnosis, it felt to me like it was really fast. Like you were making decisions, really thoughtful decisions, but really aligned with what you wanted to do.
It was really fast, and I was really lucky that I reached out to a lot of people and I was like, who knows somebody who has MS, who's taken medication or not taken medication? I want to talk to everybody. I want to talk to everybody. And I did. And I spent like 2 or 3 weeks talking to everybody about their experience so I could make an informed decision. And that is part of why we are even here because I could not find those kinds of stories on the internet. Or it's like I was like Googling stuff and it wasn't what I needed. Like I wanted to hear like, how did you make that decision? What led you to make that decision? Like I want to know everything about that. And so, you know what I mean? So that's part of why we're here.
I just want to acknowledge about you is how courageous you were in the face of all of this
Hmm.
and how you really stayed grounded and true to yourself. You're like, okay, well, there's a little bit more information I need over here, but it was always your information. You didn't, that decision was nobody else's, right? You pulled all of the data and then you used that for your direction
Yeah.
with incredible grace and presence. Um, what did you think were the surprises in all of this or the moments of grace that you noticed?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have to go back to a moment that happened in my 20s, because I think it really starts there. Like I've said, I had my first MS hug, presumably, when I was 19, and when I was in my 20s, I started practicing yoga, and I subscribed to Yoga Journal for years, read them cover to cover, loved them, loved them, loved them. And I only remember one issue that came out in probably the year after I started practicing yoga. So I was probably 27, maybe 26. And I had that magazine literally probably until very recently because I held on to those magazines. And it was the cover and the main story was about a woman who had MS, who managed her MS with yoga. Why that I mean, it was just it touched me so deeply, and I just thought, "Wow, if she can manage a condition like MS." And remember back then, this was a long time ago, they did not have the medications they have now. People were just like, "You're on your own," and she managed her MS with yoga, and I thought, "If she can do that with yoga, what's possible for me?" Not knowing that at the time I had MS. And then that actually put me on a path of like things would happen. Like I had mystery symptoms. I would get weird like numbness, or and I'd be like, oh, I pinched something. Like things would happen and I would adjust how I treated my body. I would adjust my sleep. I would adjust my self-care practices. I would adjust my stress reduction approach. I would adjust how I ate. Like, and over the years, like my body has just kind of spoken to me. And because of my introduction to yoga early on, I thought, well, how can I take care of myself better to kind of keep myself healthy, not knowing that now looking back on it, I think a lot of those things were probably MS symptoms that I was in fact managing just, on my own. And so I have to start there because to me, that is the thing that like brings me to tears and like, wow, the life that my husband and I have lived going overseas, moving all the time, that would not have been possible if I had been diagnosed with MS before then. We would not have been able to go where we went. The military would not have allowed that. And so the timing, the way that I have taken care of all those things along the way. And then also this leads to this whole idea that like the thing that surprised me most actually was that when I looked at the guidelines that's laid out for people who have MS, like here are the lifestyle choices that it's important for you to implement, like no drinking, no smoking, meditation, focus on sleep, healthy food. Like I'm like, thank God I do all those things already, right? Like I can't imagine having a diagnosis like that and being like, "Oh, and now you need to change your whole life."
Yeah, and you need to change your whole life and pick a medicine and right? I mean, all the things. What would you say to a person who's just been diagnosed?
I can't help but bring this back to you and like our experiences of diagnosis were so wildly different. We're going to talk about yours, but like I would not like the thing that I said to you is like you need to let yourself be where you are, right? Like you need to grieve. You need
Can you use the words that you actually used? No, this was
no.
way back. No.
Yeah, no, but, like, letting yourself be angry, not trying to make meaning too quickly, like, letting yourself be in the process of having feelings about it. Like, of course you do. Of course you do. I have feelings about it, but my feelings are different because I didn't end up with a cane or a walker or a wheelchair. It could happen at some point, and at that point, if I did, like, I would definitely have feelings about it, and I don't think that trying to dismiss those feelings is helpful. But I also think it's so important to, like, have those feelings and also focus on what's still available to you and build on that. In fact, diagnosis is not identity, and I know you and I have talked about that ad nauseum, like, it is not who we are so much bigger and more than that. But it can feel like when you receive a diagnosis like that, that it should or could become your entire identity. And that's what I'll say. Like it doesn't have to be, and it won't be if acknowledge your feelings and and also focus on who you want to be. Who you want to be even with this diagnosis.
Yeah. I know somebody once said to me, "Your condition is not your character." And it really hit me because I was feeling, um, what would we call it? Sort of condition shame, right? When you're no longer healthy or you're healthy, but you have a condition that impacts you in some way, right? I'm not even going to say no longer healthy, but there's a sort of shame about that because this sort of wellness appreciation of wellness, and that if you're not, then you must have done something.
Right.
Right, or, that whole rushing to, I love, Kate Bowler's book, Everything Happens for a Reason, and Other Lies We Tell Ourselves, right? It's just so there's a lot of that out there, which, then puts the onus on, "Well, you must have been really bad," or, those choices," and then so there's this definitely this shame, and it's not, it's just an aspect that we now navigate with as much grace that we can.
Absolutely. And I'm sure we will talk more about that, that mindset, that kind of that we hold culturally around it's your fault. I am sure we will talk more about that, but absolutely, like, it's not your fault. Your feelings are valid and need to be felt and expressed. Um, the other thing I would say is that connection. Like, I have met a lot of people who hide it, and finding people that you can talk to about what's happening to you is so incredibly valuable, so valuable. And I really honestly think seeking out stories of people who are living with the condition and thriving, you know, it's so important to see that and to know that you're not alone, that you too can have that, that it doesn't define you.
For sure. I love all of those things. Yeah, feeling the feelings, community, it doesn't define you. Anything else that you would add that you would want to share on another pearl?
Oh, I don't think so. I think we should like stop it here, but gosh, I just so appreciate, even telling the story. I think every time I talk about it and tell somebody about the story that of my diagnosis, I get something out of it too. Like our stories are so powerful and so meaningful, and not just to me, but hopefully to other people as well. So thank you. I think this is a great start to our gathering around the campfire.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Yes. Thank you so much for sharing. You are right. There is magic in the stories. Right? We see each other in a different dimension. And I think I don't know, there is magic in the stories. I think they create the community.
Thank you so much. Mwah.
Mwah.
Did you enjoy this campfire conversation? Please rate our podcast wherever you're listening to light the way for others to find the Autoimmune Campfire. The information provided on the Autoimmune Campfire is for educational or informational purposes only. It is not intended nor implied as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always, always consult your physician or other qualified healthcare provider with any questions you might have regarding a medical condition or treatment plan. The Autoimmune Campfire does not recommend or endorse any specific tests, physicians, products, procedures, opinions, or other information that may be mentioned on this site or podcast. Recording and editing wizardry by Make Your Day Richer. Thanks for joining Helen and I around the campfire.